Energy's session. My name is Megan, and I'm Student Energy's Space for Youth Coordinator, and I'm so excited to welcome everybody to this session, Achieving an Equitable and Sustainable Energy Transition, where we'll be talking about the importance of social data, best practices for intergenerational collaboration, and how to support youth-led action. So for this session, we'll be introducing you all to the Youth Policy Innovation Team, which is a global team of young people that have been working to analyze the data that's come from Student Energy's Global Youth Energy Outlook. So before we dive deeper into this project and look at some of the insights that the youth have been able to pull from this data, we wanted to get a better understanding of where everyone is joining us from, because this Innovate for Cities conference is very unique in the way that it's a global conference, but everyone's joining locally from wherever, which regions they're from. So to participate, just let us know where you're joining from. And I've included the link to this polling software where you'll be able to submit your answers to this question. So feel free to take out your phone or pull up a browser and enter this website, menti.com, and enter the code to join. And I'll pull up the poll here so that everyone can see where participants are joining from. So we have a few participants joining in from East Asia and Chicago. We'll give it another minute just for some of the answers to trickle in. Okay, amazing. So the reason why we asked to see where these participants are coming from is just to talk about how global this conference is, but also how global our team is, because the Youth Policy Innovation Team is joining in from so many different places around the world. And that's what's exciting about this conference and this project as well, is to have that interdisciplinary and global collaboration from all parts of the world on youth policy and city level climate action. So moving on, we're going to dive deeper into who we are as an organization, Student Energy, and some of the partners that have collaborated on this project with us. So Student Energy is a global organization that's been working to build the next generation of energy leaders. We're currently working with a really large network, actually, with over 50,000 young people from 120 plus countries around the world who are already leading that transition towards a sustainable and equitable energy future. To support this work, we have collaborated with a large range of different actors within the energy industry. That includes governments, companies, and other organizations to facilitate meaningful youth engagement and to mobilize resources in support of youth-led energy solutions. Because we found that oftentimes young people are really passionate about these kinds of issues, but don't often get the same resources or have the same social capital to be able to act on this passion. So diving into the history a little bit further of student energy, it started as an idea between three young people in Canada that felt like there weren't enough opportunities and spaces for young people to have a say in their energy future. So exactly what I was saying earlier about having that passion, but not necessarily having the same resources or spaces to be able to act. This is what led to Student Energy's first ever International Student Energy Summit, which brought together young people from all over the world to collaborate with industry professionals in the energy sector and talk about issues that mattered most to them. And from there, that's where that movement sparked and began, and the organization was able to build out more programs and opportunities that were all inspired by this first generation of young energy leaders. So this is just a map outlining how much our network has grown since 2009 when it started off. And our network has been able to grow enormously through the combined global programming that draws young people from every corner around the globe. Some of our programs include our chapters program, which involves young people in university chapters of Student Energy that work on their own community projects. Also the International Student Energy Summit, which I mentioned earlier. And we actually just had our first virtual summit last week, where we were able to take the summit virtually for the first time, given everything that's been going on in the world. And of course, we also have our Space for Youth program, where we work to create more space for young people to act at decision-making tables. And this is where the Youth Policy Innovation team came out of. Besides that, all of our work has been focused on our theory of change. So the concept of building out change agents who will be actors in accelerating the energy transition. And a lot of our funders include people like, or organizations and institutions like the Government of Denmark, Indigenous Clean Energy, XPRIZE, and Sustainable Energy for All. And then our newest program that we're building out is our Ventures program, which enhances our programming to be able to motivate young people and deploy clean energy solutions globally. So through our Space for Youth program that I mentioned earlier, we've been able to work and collaborate with a variety of amazing partners, and including the Global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy. And the way that this partnership started was after being engaged with each other on a variety of different initiatives to include young people in those decision-making processes for cities. We saw an opportunity to create a more climate resilient cities by leveraging those youth perspectives and innovation from young people. GCOM is an international alliance of cities committed to developing climate resilient futures. And so we found this to be a really valuable opportunity to include young people and give them a say in their futures, the futures of their cities, while learning about policy and urban planning processes. And then another partner involved in this project is the Melbourne Centre for Cities. And this is a research center under the University of Melbourne that provides an explicit focus on urban governance as it relates to research, action, and training. The center focuses mainly on the role that cities play in major societal challenges, how city leadership can address them, and also the information that's needed to do so. So the center, along with GCOM, has really helped to design the methodology for this project and introduce our youth team to data analysis and policy development. So now that you know a little bit more about the different organizations involved in this project, I'd like to provide a bit of background into the actual data that the youth team was working with. So the data that they used to extract some of the youth perspectives that they're about to show you in this presentation is actually from Student Energy's Global Youth Energy Outlook. The Outlook is the first youth-led project of its kind, and it's engaged over 40,000 young people ages 18 to 30 from 180 countries, a lot more than 100, countries and territories from around the world since it began. The project is led by a team of 12 regional coordinators who worked to engage young people in their respective regions with the outlook. We're super thrilled to have supporters of this research from every sector, including the research and academia sector, such as SEI, University of Melbourne, to governments such as the Government of Canada, Denmark, Sweden, and also governments within the Global Covenant of Mayors, and also the private sector in companies like D&B. The outlook itself consists of a questionnaire that was translated into multiple languages to help expand reach and make sure that we're capturing as many youth voices as possible. And as well, on top of that, there were also regional dialogues that were hosted by the regional coordinators that I mentioned earlier. And these dialogues aimed to engage young people on energy issues that were relevant in their regions. So there was two different ways that young people could contribute their perspectives, both in a written format through the survey and questionnaire, and through just having discussions with other young people about important issues. Overall, the outlook aimed to answer two main questions. And that is, what actions do young people want to see happen to deliver a sustainable energy transition by 2030? And the second one is, how do young people want to be a part of energy solutions needed for this transition? So these are some of the partners that I mentioned. And then this map gives us a better look at the outlook and how it organized different regions in the world that it worked with, and where each of the regional coordinators were based and which youth they engaged with around the world. So that leads us into our current project, which is the Youth Policy Innovation Team that we were able to develop and form with the help of GCOM and the Melbourne Centre for Cities. The Youth Policy Innovation Team is made up of young people from all around the world. And on this slide, you can see each one of those youth team members and the regions that they're based in. Most of them were also regional coordinators that worked directly on the outreach and initial outlook questionnaire and regional dialogues. And they decided to join on to this team to continue their work with the outlook data. So over the past couple of months, the team has worked really hard to clean the data from the questionnaire and conduct data analysis of that cleaned data. So for the purpose of this project and the scope of this project, they looked mostly at the questions in the outlook that related to GCOM's research and innovation priorities, and also looked at questions that gave direct insight into the youth vision for the future of the energy system. So moving on, now that I've given an overview of what the project is, I'm super excited to introduce two of our Youth Policy Innovation team members, Allison and Paula, who will be speaking more about the team's findings, insights, and the work that they did for this data. So go ahead, you two, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Megan. So I think we might just want to start off with asking everyone in the audience another question. And if you could also go into the Menti link down below to put in any of your insight or what your answers are. So the question we'd like to put to everyone in the audience today is, if you could solve one climate or clean energy challenge today, what would it be? So Megan's just gonna move over to the Menti page in a bit. But if people in the audience could put down their answers, we'd love to kind of hear, especially if there's anyone who also identifies as a youth or young person in the audience, we'd also really like to hear your answers as well. So I might just give it a moment while people put in their answers. Oh, we've got one come up. Policy barriers. Yeah, less fossil fuels, definitely a big one. Decarbonization as well. Those are definitely some things that have come up in our data for the youth energy outlook analysis as well. Oh, wow, there's a lot that's come through. Decentralization is also definitely a big one. Affordability, climate justice, yeah, they're all really great ideas. Paula, is there any that you kind of wanted to point out whilst this graph keeps moving? It keeps moving on my screen, so it's really exciting to see.
Yeah, I really love how they are talking about inclusive policy making, because most of the times when we are talking about climate justice, energy justice, policy or decision making process need to be inclusive. You need to take into account the voice of those that are most affected by climate change, because you need to hear their experiences and how they need you to solve the problems. It's not that governments could go with their ideas to solve any climate or energy problem in an indigenous community. Let's imagine is that they need governments, but they need governments to tackle these policies for helping them in these issues, but they need to do it in governance spaces. So you cannot go push and say, I want to do this. You need to be inclusive in this policy decision making. So it could be like, I know, like efficient, real, things like that. I wanted to punt or to uh, point that in these old ideas that are really incredible.
Yeah. And I think even like all of the ideas that are mentioned in that Menti board there, some of them we definitely did come across through our global sort of like data analysis as well. So thank you everyone for sharing your answers. Megan, if you wouldn't mind hopping back into the slides, we're also really excited to share with you some of the I guess, a brief insight into what the initial data analysis that our team has come through, just some key global data points. So in the next slide here, these are only just the three initial points that we'd like to point out. But first of all, one thing that we really noticed is that nearly 73% of youth surveyed were very concerned or moderately concerned about the pollution and emissions caused by the current global energy system. And just over 50% of youth surveyed believe their government needs to invest more in fighting climate change. And last but not least, 81.5% of youth surveyed believe their country or territory should have a decarbonization target for its energy system. And of those youths, 62.4% wanted to have a decarbonization target for 2030. So what does that mean? To summarize in the next slide, youths are wanting to see decarbonization targets more faster and quicker in time. And they've also identified governments needing to be more accountable for climate change action, but also have named businesses and industries as key players in taking more responsibility in reducing climate emissions. So as such, it's clear that youths are wanting to see change in the when, who, and how global climate or clean energy challenges are addressed. So to dive into these perspectives a bit further, we'll now then be looking at some specific sort of research and innovation priorities, as well as youth visions on future energy systems that have come through in the global energy outlook analysis that we did. So in the next slide here, you'll see that the first sort of like regional differences that we came across was in terms of the barriers to sustainable energy transitions. So when we asked that question to youth across the regions, what they saw as the biggest barrier to sustainable energy transitions, 8 of the 10 regions listed government willpower, policies, and regulations as the biggest barrier to sustainable energy transitions. In particular, as you can see on the slide, over 50% of youths in Latin America and Caribbeans voted for this option. Interestingly, however, instead of government willpower, policies and regulation, youths in Africa and East Asian regions voted differently. So they voted for current energy industries and available technology as their biggest barriers instead. So potentially, just again, looking into sort of like the existing context of these regions in Africa, funding and testing of renewable energy systems is one of the main contributors to this barrier, whereas in the East Asian region, this also most likely links back to the ongoing strong reliance on hydrocarbon, coal, and fossil fuel and other non-renewable energy sources as well. So another regional difference that we'd also like to point out in the next slide. So this was another question we asked youth in the survey, was to identify what priority actions businesses and industries should take for climate change action. And it was found that all regions agreed that lobbying government on decarbonization was definitely a top priority action that businesses and industries should take. And most of the regions chose, apart from that top one option to lobby government on decarbonization, their top second priority action was to reduce company emissions and create policies to do so. And then the third top option was committing to becoming carbon neutral or carbon negative. Again, interestingly, East Asian youths selected something different for their top 2 and top 3 options. So their top 2 option was to invest in research, and then the third priority action was instead creating the policies to reduce company emissions. So again, this kind of attributes back to that region's particular strong reliance on non-renewable energy resources, and also perhaps reflects on how youths want more transparency and accessible research to instigate stronger sustainable energy transitions in their region. So in the next slide, you'll see this is another question we asked. So another key statistic to point out here is the response for youth vision on future government investment in climate change action. So whilst youth across all regions said that we needed to invest more as their top response, the second most common responses were sort of divided between those who were satisfied with current investments versus those who have said we have not invested at all. So Latin America and Caribbeans and the Southeast Asian youth regions, those 2 regions there were in particularly noted to have said that no investment was made as their second most common option, most common response, sorry. And potentially this again sort of highlights that need for greater actions in those regions, particularly again, linking back to how government investment in those regions may be slower or slightly weaker in comparison to the other regions. And something that could have contributed to that is sort of that widespread perception that renewable energy is more expensive, and also certain challenges that they face in expanding their power generation to meet population growth, as well as improving electricity reliability and accessibility. And looking back at the other remaining regions who had satisfied with current investments as their second most common response, East Asia again in particular was noted to have a comparable divide between their top 2 responses. So nearly 37% said that we needed to invest more, but on the other hand, there was only a 1% difference in youth who said that they were already satisfied with current investments. So whilst we kind of might need more further analysis to explore that unique divide, this definitely still highlights that the need for more transparency and accountability in government investment in climate change action is needed. So youth know that their actions are creating impact, and they can also engage or support wherever is relevant as well. So in the next slide here, the government's role in climate change action is definitely still highlighted in this other question that we asked, where for youth to identify who is most responsible to reduce emissions. So as you can see here on the slide, youth across all regions identified the government as most responsible. This was then followed by the business and industries, and then other organizations. So whilst in terms of the responses, there were some overlaps between the most common responses. So for instance, in the Middle East and West Asian regions, Oceania and South Asia, there were overlaps between businesses and industries as both their top, second, and third most common response, or either having their government most responsible as their top one or second option. As you can see, they still kind of remained in those three options there. But interestingly to note here is that in Southeast Asia, their third most common response for that was actually families, neighborhood, and communities. And so a brief sort of insight into that particular region highlights how emissions at the household level are also really greatly considered amongst youths. And it highlights how youth also really appreciate more bottom-up approaches as an alternative to reducing emissions. And this is sort of also an acknowledgement that, citizen engagement is really something that's a powerful toolkit in shaping more stronger and resilient sustainable energy transitions as well. And so in the next bit here, Paula, would you like to continue on to talk about the last two regional differences that we wanted to highlight?
Yeah, I can do it. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. The government's role in climate change action is also highlighted in many of these parts, like the regional differences between funding the transition to net zero. So the most commonly identified across all regions response is tax the production of emissions. We are going to talk about these kind of policies later, but this means that companies that produce emissions will need to pay this tax. Over 55% of youth agree in Latin America for the tax of the production of emissions, 50 to 54% in other regions like Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and Southeast Asia. And under 50% youth agree about this tax the production of emissions. We can go next, please. Okay. So this is the global energy mix in 2018, but let's talk a bit about this. To meet its energy needs, each country uses the types of energy available to it in different proportions. This is what we call the energy mix. And as you may know and see in the graph that is sampled from 2018, the majority of the global energy mix is led by fossil fuels like oil, coal, and natural gas. And I would like you to remember the percentage of renewable energy in this mix. You can see that it is fairly 2% of the total. Next, please. And here you can see the results from the question that we made in the investigation, in the research. How do you imagine the energy mix in your region by 2030? And of course, it varies for each region, with the smallest percentage in Middle East and West Asia with 14.6% of renewables, and the biggest percentage in Latin America with 31%. So imagine, on average, young people globally want the energy mix with 20% of renewable energy by 2030. Remember, I told you to keep in mind this 2% in the last slide. So it means that we need to go from the 2% that we have now in our energy mix to 20% in 2030. So it is 10 times. It means like 10 times of efforts in policies to promote renewables, 10 times for financing the transition. In generally, it means we need to do 10 times what we do now to achieve the energy transition or to achieve the energy future that young people want in 2030. So it means we need to do a lot, and we need to have 10 times of effort, finance, resources, and most things. Next, please. So, considering the worldwide results, there is an urgent need to accelerate the action led by governments for energy transition, and not till 2050 as the Paris Agreement states, but till 2030 as young people propose, since the results in this investigation. And given the worrying actual context because of climate change, one of the most powerful actions led by governments are the development of transparent and efficient policies focused in climate action. But also, given the climate emergency, policies need to have a focus on climate justice, be action-oriented to have clear and tangible results, and should also consider the inclusion of everyone, like indigenous communities and the most affected by climate change, securing to leave no one behind. We know that funding the energy transition is a great challenge for all stakeholders. And according to our results, 46% of young people part of the survey chose taxing the production of emissions as their preferred way of funding the transition to net zero carbon emissions. Companies that produce emissions would pay this tax. We know, but also taxing the emissions bring up the creation of carbon markets, and even there are some challenges as the uncertainty of its effectiveness as the real solution for energy transition. Because of this, most young people recommend that governments could create initial policies for carbon markets that will be the path, so that after these same governments could develop more specific laws to promote companies not only to pay for their emissions, but to have emission targets in their value chain. Next, please. So, from the young people who respond to the survey, 38% said that there are meaningful opportunities for youth to work on sustainable energy issues directly with policymakers in their country or territory. For that, to take advantage of the youth commitment and innovation for climate action, governments should develop at local and national levels formal entities of youth representation to include them in the decision-making process of climate and energy policies, considering the transparency and representation of the most affected by climate change effects. And also, from the survey, 13% say that public or community support is the biggest barrier to achieving sustainable energy transition in their country or territory. And most of the time, this situation is because of the lack of a climate conscious society. For that, it is crucial policies to reform education systems, to support climate resilience workforce, to raise the local support for climate action. In this sense, policies for climate education and climate literacy with the adequate funding is crucial to empower all generations with the skills, knowledge, and values with a holistic approach. Integrating indigenous and local knowledge is crucial for the future climate action. Next, please. Young people also selected research and innovation as the second most important factor to sustainable energy transition leading to 2030. So policies to financing research and development in innovation to make processes and energy technology more efficient and competitive is required. Conveniently, we're in the Innovate for Cities conference where we could talk about innovation. So returning to policies for research and innovation, these policies need funding from governments and different stakeholders to create capacity building programs for young people in innovation and research to create technologies for the energy transition. As we know, energy transition have incredible technologies like renewables, batteries, capture technology, and more. But for sure, there are other big challenges like energy efficiency, energy storage, electricity in the transport sector, and more. So for sure, policies that could empower young people with knowledge, with the technology to develop more technologies for energy transition is crucial, and especially in most of the countries like in the global south that doesn't have access to technology and doesn't have access to these kind of training and programs to empower young people to have like this research and innovation approach for energy transition. So I would like to pass. That was what we wanted to share about the insights and also the policies, recommendations we could give regarding to the results that came out from our investigation. So I would like to give the floor again, maybe to Megan, who will share more about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison and Paula, for presenting all the different findings and policy recommendations that you have from the initial data analysis that the team has done. We're looking to do a bit of more data analysis into some of the data that was found from the Outlook so that the youth team is able to work with more information and provide larger policy recommendations in more detail. So the next step of this project is to do some of that data analysis, further data analysis, and then build out a report for what youth are saying about the energy transition. So that's something to look out for. So for this part of the session, we're just going to open it up to all the different speakers that we have here backstage on our side to talk about validating the youth-led approach and why this project is so important and why youth engagement is so important. So the first question that we'll be talking about is, what does this tell us about the validity of youth lived experience and understanding of their community needs and the importance of social data in integrated policy design? So I'd like to invite Paris, if you'd like to answer this question first about research from the Melbourne Centre for Cities and the research side.
Thanks so much, Megan. I have a couple of reflections on this question. First is that, of course, youth are key stakeholders who experience cities and towns as residents and citizens, and they also clearly have aspirations for future cities in a climate change context. And so young people's views on priorities and needs for climate action are not typically incorporated, through democratic election processes, while younger generations also are inheriting the environment and climate conditions shaped by historical trajectories of fossil fuel-based and resource-intensive systems of production and consumption. So these aspects put forward a strong procedural and distributive justice argument for more democratic youth engagement in urban climate policy design and implementation. And I think these insights demonstrate the richness of youth's understanding of climate change and their concern for systems change. And from a research and education perspective, I think there are also great opportunities for collaboration between city authorities and universities that can facilitate youth contributions for example, in understanding new applications of best practice and other youth-led research. Youth can identify and understand local problems and effective solutions through their education. And so universities and researchers can think about pathways for student learning to real-world application in cities. And these approaches are illustrated by various student hackathons and other competitions like this year's C40 Students Reinventing Cities competition. And these can be incorporated in student learning objectives and assessments to not only enrich student education, but provide that greater opportunity for contributions and application of ideas. So those are some two different aspects that I think are really important.
Yeah, thank you so much, Paris, for your answer to that question. I think youth are definitely the ones who are on the ground and facing these issues themselves. So they often have a lot of insight that is not often considered when talking about these issues, and that just makes their input all that much more important. And youth should also just have a say in their own futures, as they'll be dealing with these issues. They're dealing with these issues right now, but we'll also be dealing with them in the future as well, for sure. Not sure if any of the youth team want to weigh in on this, but feel free to jump back to this question later as well as we move through the next two questions, if you have any input to add to this. So this next question is just how could cities best use this data in their existing or planned urban planning or city level climate action plans? And I'd like to invite Kathy, if you'd like to speak to this a little bit more on GCOM's side and your work in that sector.
Yeah, thank you, Megan. And absolutely, I'm glad that we've got lots of time for this discussion now, because it will be excellent to join in. And I think anyone on the Zoom chat should raise up their hand if they've got a point or want to interject or add to what either myself or Paris have said or anything else. Because I think it's a really interesting question, and from a global Covenant of Mayors for Climate and Energy, a GCOM perspective, the first thing I wanted to say is that we really wanted to partner with Student Energy for many reasons, and but one of the key reasons we wanted to engage with you is because your ability to really extract an amazing amount of information from your huge network on priorities that obviously cities are very interested in, like how do we transition and how do we engage, and in that question about how, we're talking about what are the best mechanisms to drive change, who are the people we need to speak to, but also how do you prioritize the limited resources or the policy changes that need to happen. And this team has been working for such a short period of time, but on a huge database. And the insights that you've just presented, I think, really highlighted why this partnership is really important. And so my initial response is actually at a GCOM city network level, that the best thing that we could do, or how could we best use this information that you're provided, and mindful that it's only the preliminary and the interim results, and we are expecting a full a full report at the end of the year. And I think that's really exciting leading into what we want to do next year, because that's post COP and that's post the big climate meetings this year. It's that how do we move forward to really accelerate. And so from a city network perspective, I think GCOM could absolutely use this data to connect with our regional offices. So the Global Covenant of Mayors, there's over 10,000, I think we're up to 12,000 cities representing 1 billion people, I believe. If you look at the website with commitments on emissions reductions. And I think the best thing we can do going into 2022 is not only continue this partnership with Student Energy, but really connect the regional data that you've just presented with our regional offices, because that cities are always asking for city-specific data, and what you've delivered is that. You've actually provided a youth voice at that city level, at that regional level, and so it's much more meaningful, because then as politicians or as city leaders, city decision makers, you can, you know, the evidence you're providing is actually relevant at that local or regional scale. So absolutely, from a GCOM perspective, connecting up the data with our regional offices, and if you want specifics, I think the best thing we can do is you know, provide those forums for that interchange and that exchange. But I do note that some of the priorities that were identified, or many of the priorities that were identified that are at that big scale, like carbon taxing, or taxing and large scale transition to alternative fuels, a lot of those areas are outside of the remit of cities. So on advocacy, you know, what city leaders or city networks can do is join up with groups like Student Energy to help advocate on behalf of, or with, more importantly, with, not on behalf of, the youth on that regional level. So, you know, advocate to the national governments, trying to provide platforms for this youth perspectives to be presented, because in youth perspective, it's an important constituency for city decisions, city leaders. You know, these are the, if not already voting, the future voting source. So, you know, if these are the priorities of your community, then these are the priorities that you should be listening to if you want to be a politician for as long as possible. So I think, yeah, so from cities can best use this data also to help prioritize their climate action plans. There's while many, or you know, GCOM cities in particular have got very ambitious net zero plans, most of them, getting there is still very complicated and difficult, because they're also relying on other levels of government to invest in their ideas and their ambition. But anything that can help a city to prioritize their limited resources or their limited power is really valuable. And so again, cities can best use this data to help them make better decisions. And your data is so rich and really, so I think it's incredibly valuable, many things. And then this is one thing I'd be interested for the panel to respond to, or the team, is, you know, how do we do that meaningfully? And I think, Paris, you spoke on this a little bit, and others have as well, that at a city level, there are, you know, we've heard of youth mayors or youth panels or youth teams, but how do we make sure that these are meaningful, sustained, and it's not a one-way conversation, that it's not it's not give us your ideas and then, yep, see you later. It's actually, how do we actually have these youth participation processes? Maybe they're not long-term, but, you know, participatory processes only work if they are genuine, that that there is an outcome that the participants can see actually happen. But how do we do that? And it is a bit of, it's not necessarily $1 million answer, you know, it's respect and reciprocity, and it's actually listening and providing platform. But yeah, I'd be really interested to hear your ideas on that, because with my other hat at the University of Melbourne, the Melbourne Centre for Cities is working with the Foundation for Young Australians actually on this very issue about youth mayors, and looking at research, a piece of research that the Foundation for Young Australians is actually just completing about what are the best models for youth representation within a city framework. And so really any ideas would be fabulous. So again, we're listening from you, but hopefully we're working on pathways to make it happen. So back over to you, Megan or Helen.
Megan,
Yeah,
can I jump in? Is that okay?
Yeah, for sure.
I love that. Okay, amazing. Yeah, oh my God, Kathy, so many things. First of all, I'm like, $1 million idea. We could pay so many youth to do deep research work with us with $1 million. So that would be an amazing endeavor in and of itself. But no, yeah, 100%. I mean, I think it's it's a challenge in many different directions where like we reach certain barriers at a municipal versus subnational versus federal level. And like we've experienced that a lot ourselves. And, you know, there's a lot of, there's varying levels of receptiveness to working with youth in meaningful ways. But I think as we shift into like more of a, you know, how do you do meaningful youth engagement? I think still like our partnership has been a great example of that. You all came in and were very much, you know, prioritized the same values that we did in terms of making sure that youth were compensated for their time, that they were involved in really meaningful ways, that they led the work, the direction, et cetera. And I still think that's a huge part of it. But, you know, when it comes to how cities can best use this data in their existing or planned urban planning and city climate action plans, kind of come back to the question, for me, it still comes down to a very kind of practical argument about, you know, if we want these things to, if we want these efforts, these climate action efforts to be something that will last us the next 5 to 10 years, it's really foolish not to include youth. Like it just doesn't really make sense. Young people are really our opportunity to future-proof and embed a lot of longevity into our planning at this stage. And I think that in particular, city level and regional level governments have a lot to gain from engaging with young people at this stage, because there's a lot of public advocacy and public support that is to be gained from working with young people at this stage. So for me, I'm like, you know, there's a lot to gain from a climate advocacy perspective. We can get a lot of, you know, long lasting support, a lot of public advocacy, a lot of voting, a lot of, just general public support around these issues. But from more of a corporate or public sector or even, you know, intergovernmental organization perspective, it is quite important to have young people who are quite engaged and interested in and invested in these issues in a more long-term way. So for me, like there's this kind of long-term thinking around it that's quite important. We often also talk about how cities can use this data in their urban planning as a way to create more equity in the space. And I think that's something that we haven't touched too much on, but is something that came up a lot in this project as we were talking internally in our meetings. Is we learned a lot about how this data can tell us more about where inequities still exist very pervasively in the climate action space, particularly how young people are able to participate. And it's not even just how young people are able to participate, but also like the priorities that they see as most important. You know, for young people, a lot of the time they don't really perceive this trade-off between, you know, we have to achieve rapid decarbonization through technological means. And as a result, we're going to, you know, exclude X amount of people from society and they won't be able to, you know, there's not really that trade-off that exists in some conversations that we see. For young people, they're very much like, this is a systems-wide transformation. And I think Innovate for Cities has very much embodied that as well. And that like, there is very much this cross-sectoral effort to not just change, not just, you know, impact climate action, but also just transform our system in a broader way. And young people are very much invested in that as well. This is an opportunity to bring more young people into this conversation that have not been part of this conversation before, who have not been able to be part of this conversation before, and this project has enabled us to do that as well. So maybe, sorry, I've definitely rambled a little bit, but Megan, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, I think the only thing that I was going to say was that I think it is definitely really important what you said about including all young people in these kinds of processes, and especially those who haven't necessarily had those opportunities before, because oftentimes when you have these youth engagement opportunities, it's a certain pool of young people that have access to these opportunities more often than others. So just taking that into consideration, I think, is important. And I was just like so excited to hear about what you had to say about that as well, Kathy, about you know, Global Covenant of Mayors gives that opportunity for cities to work together and collaborate intercity wise, I guess, on different climate issues. But having youth put into that equation as well, and having youth collaboration on top of having that inter-city collaboration would be so amazing to see and so exciting as well. And I think that kind of pretty much went into our next question anyways, which is just about youth engagement and like how can other organizations do this well. So I guess I'll open it up to the floor again, like if anyone else has any input, maybe if the youth team has any input, or if Kathy, Paris, or Helen, you have anything else to say.
Can I jump in? This is Jarrett.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I'm not sure if it's answering directly the question, but it sparked a few thoughts for me. So I just think there's been a lot of talk about the power of young people. I don't mean by this group, just generally in society, the power of young people and not enough empowering of young people. Okay, there's a big difference there. And we on the policy innovation team are very grateful to Student Energy and GCOM, but this is an isolated opportunity that has engaged 10 of us, while there are millions of young leaders who are capable of creating a better future. Young leaders deserve to be treated as equals in a conversation with senior leaders and become colleagues, like Kathy alluded to. It's not a one-way conversation where perhaps, you know, a senior leader is listening to a young person and they can say, okay, we check that off our list. You know, we talk to them. No, it has to be, we are equals, we are our colleagues. And young people are solutions oriented. We're not just here for social media activism. We absolutely have the competencies to contribute to real hard policy. We are well aware that the energy transition will be disruptive and expensive, but we are creative, we are problem solvers, and we will persist until what needs to be done is done for the future of humanity. We care about the future of this world, and I always think that Indigenous knowledge should be highlighted more. And here in the United States, yesterday was Indigenous Peoples Day. And when I've met colleagues in this space who are Indigenous, I've learned so much from them. And I now abide by the 7th generation principle, which stipulates decisions that we make today should result in a sustainable world 7 generations into the future. So I think, you know, that's really, all those things are important to keep in mind. And then I was thinking, to answer Kathy's question, sustainability of initiatives such as the one we're part of will come from buy-in from senior leaders and from funders. Hopefully this group provides proof of concept, but certainly, you know, such initiatives do need multi-year support, right? Like you said, we've been working on it for a few months, but, you know, there's more of our colleagues who are not part of the group who should come after, and you know, they should serve for a year and then another year after that. So I'll stop there for now.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's it's really important to highlight that long-term input that you said, because that's how you make it effective. When it comes from not just a one-time opportunity, but it turns into like a longer term opportunity for meaningful collaboration for sure. Yeah, Helen, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I feel like I just spoke, but I would love to jump in on this point in particular about what's next. I think, yeah, Jarrett, everything you said is like ideal, like exactly what we're thinking all the time. It's not just about this group of you know, you guys are awesome, but we need to expand this and scale this, and that's really the challenge that we're facing right now, is how do we scale this effort so that every young person feels like they have access to opportunities to, whether it's pursuing research, whether it's pursuing, you know, technological development, whether it's pursuing advocacy within their community, that should be something that every young person feels like they have access to and a clear pathway towards pursuing. So something that Student Energy is actually working quite hard on with our new UN Energy Compact, which I'm happy to share more about offline. But I would say in terms of concrete actions that we're looking to right now, I think everything that you said, Jared, in terms of, you know, mainstreaming and creating long-term plans, that's something that we actually get a lot of pushback from, not in any part by the partners that we're working with here. I would say kind of more largely when we've worked in the past with other organizations, we've had a lot of resistance to creating long-term strategies around youth engagement. And we're excited about starting this one. We're kind of at stage 1 right now with GCOM and Connected Cities Lab, but in the past it's been quite hard to work with particularly kind of more national level governments and UN agencies and organizations like that. Like it can be, it's not to say that like it's impossible. It's more to say that like it takes a lot of time. These are larger organizations with a lot of intricacies and a lot of bureaucracy, and so it can be quite challenging to create more longer term strategies for how we embed youth engagement in a really meaningful way within those institutions. Within other organizations as well, like it can be quite hard. So that's definitely an effort that's worth pursuing, is how can we mainstream in the long term. I would also say like the compensation of youth is something that like we've kind of faced a lot of barriers around in our past, again, not more recent history, but in our past, like it's been something that we've weirdly faced some pushback on in the past. And I think compensation of youth is something that we've started to kind of push for more actively with partners that we work with and organizations that we partner with, is kind of a baseline, is valuing youth contributions and time and energy is very important to us. Yeah, and there's some really interesting kind of unique case studies that kind of fall by the wayside now and again, where governments work with youth really effectively and it kind of gets lost. I will highlight very quickly for the group here. Government of Jamaica actually recently did a really interesting youth engagement strategy through the NDC partnership. Happy to share more information in the chat here, but it's really unique. They hadn't really done much youth engagement before. They had done it through the Caribbean, one of the Caribbean branches of the UNFCCC. But the NDC partnership kind of came in, started working with them, and we know the NDC partnership quite well as well, and started developing a youth engagement strategy. So this stuff is not, we're not talking about building a wheel from square one here. Like there are very good case practices, including ours, Student Energy plus GCOM plus Connected Cities Lab. There are others like Government of Jamaica, many others in the field that we can kind of build off of. So this is not kind of, radical ideas that we're proposing here. It's more so kind of building off best case practices and building longevity in our movement that we're all kind of working towards.
I can see, sorry, Megan, I just got distracted by the chat. We've got lots of people who want to jump in. I don't know how we do this, but I'll let you go back to moderating, but I see that we've got Paula and Kayla itching to jump into the conversation.
Yeah, I saw that. I think we can just go in order. So maybe Paris, if you want to give your input first, and then Kyla, and then Paula.
Thanks, Megan. I just wanted to highlight what I'm hearing in terms of how to, I think, Helen, you said mainstream youth engagement. And, we're here at the Innovate for Cities conference. Perhaps a form of innovation that might be overlooked in this discourse is a governance innovation and institutional innovation and change. So actually experimenting with new ways of embedding youth input in city decision making, for example, the way that can derive lessons for local government in terms of what's effective, what's meaningful, and actually, as you say, embed this as a new way of governing a city. I think that's a kind of innovation that is going to be really important for socially equitable and just transitions to low carbon cities. So that was just one point I wanted to highlight, that institutional innovation, not just substituting technologies and inventing new ones. I think that's also very important. But I'll throw back to the youth team for their reflections.
Yeah, Kyla, if you wanted to jump in here.
Hi. Yeah. So it was. I just wanted to say really insightful results from the Outlook initiative, and I did want to maybe add a little bit of flesh, a little bit of bone to the context of how, instead of the government willpower being the biggest barrier to the of what youth think from my region, it was really interesting to see how youth from East Asia chose current energy industry as well. And there has been a lot of divide. And I think this kind of comes from how South Korea, Japan, and China, for example, they have already pledged carbon neutrality. I think it was last year. And just for my country, it was, I think it was last December when President Moon launched the 2050 Carbon Neutrality Committee to meet the national goal of lowering the carbon emission to zero by 2050. And so basically, we do have ambitious goals pursued by the committee as outlined in their numerous policy roadmaps, such as eliminating completely or eliminating by 70 to 90% and such and such. So, but they don't really mention exactly how they're going to achieve this. So there has just been a vague or ambiguous mention of relying on pre-existing resources or technology that has yet to be fully developed and commercialized. So and it's a great example of what youth can do, because just this year, youth groups have been working together to propose a youth 2040 carbon neutrality scenario just from South Korea, and submitted their own version of what needs to be done to the current existing roadmaps that are being presented to affect the change that we like. So yeah, this was just a little bit of context of the data that has been resulted from the outlook. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Thanks so much for sharing that, because I think it provides a lot of context into why we might be seeing certain regional differences between these regions. You can see like that collective global youth voice and perspective that people have, but then within that, it's recognizing that youth aren't a monolith, and we all have different perspectives, and especially depending on the local context, that's how they might differ as well. So thanks for sharing that. And then Paula, you wanted to weigh in on this?
Yes, for sure. What Carl said was really interesting. Like, I didn't know that. And that is what is amazing about this project and the ones that Student Energy and GCOM are having these times. But what I would like to say about why is it important to work with young people, especially in the youth indigenous perspective, is that why? Because most of the times indigenous communities are the most affected by climate change. We have like these solutions coming up for indigenous knowledge, nature-based solutions or something like that. I would say that it's really important to have these kind of perspectives, but also it's really challenging. You know why? Because we have the language barrier. Even in my region, I'm from Latin America, we have the youth consultation for climate change that we are presented for COP26, and young people from indigenous communities have their own because of climate, because of language barriers, and all other countries have their own. So many times it's amazing to have like these spaces, but also we need to consider how we will bring those young people, consider language barrier, knowledge barrier, because even we want to bring many young people, sometimes they don't have the knowledge like to have I don't know, like a negotiation spaces or bringing to these kind of projects. We need to empower, give them the tools to make their participation really meaningful. So it's really challenging, but I could say what Student Energy is doing, and I love that we are not saying like we want to present a report and that will be the end. I wanted to be part of the Student Energy and the GCOM project since the first moment, because I said, okay, it's not going to end in that way. The report will not be the end point. So now Helen made my days, like made me really happy, like to scale up. How do we bring young people from different perspectives to be part of this? How do we bring these solutions in city levels, in national levels, bring in the challenges, so the challenge situations I told you about from the indigenous perspective. So indeed, there is a lot to do, but I'm really sure that these kind of spaces are a really good starting point, and it will bring us many things into the future.
Yeah, Kathy, you wanted to add to the conversation?
Just following on from Paula, I think that from an Indigenous youth perspective, I think it's interesting. a conversation that we started at the Daring Cities conference last year, where we first partnered and with GCOM and Student Energy on the 24 hours of dialogue. And what, the theme that did come out of that around research and innovation priorities from 4 of the 5 workshops that we held were prioritizing Indigenous youth perspectives of that future city, of the transition. And we're slowly but surely getting there, Paula, but we're, I think, in terms of that idea of it's not going to end at the report, we're wanting to find the pathways to actually help to unpack and support that particular thread. I'm really interested in that space, and importantly, interested in finding the space and me stepping back, or those that are often at the table stepping back, and within a university context, in a research context, it's so difficult. And to have the constructs that are there, the colonized constructs, to step back and have Indigenous voices prioritized in a research landscape is, it is just as difficult as getting some of the leaders that are in charge of our climate future to actually step back and let the real action to happen in a university context. It's also, it's really important. It's led by and for Indigenous youth as well. So it's about creating the spaces, finding the resources, having the pathways, and then just letting that run, rather than again, back to the idea, the conversation even about the one-way conversation just from young people in general. It can't be a one-way conversation from an Indigenous perspective either. It's not about taking those ideas and letting someone else do it. It's actually fostering those ideas and letting the Indigenous youth or Indigenous communities to lead with them.
Could I also just hop in and just add one thing as well? I think just tying it back to an individual level, like we only are able to identify as a youth within a certain age bracket. So once we move out of that age bracket, how our ideas are validated is completely different. And I think even just in terms of like engaging youths, yes, we've talked about how it's really important to find those meaningful ways in terms of getting our ideas validated, how it moves on in the long term. And I think, being able to participate in that as a young person holds so much more value than it just being in the literal sense. We need to engage young people, because the moment you change our mindsets and we change yours, that moves on in eternity. That knowledge stays with us, and we hold those skills and we can bring it forward into, the next life stage that we end up going into. And so I feel like it's something that we take for granted, because, even though there are many more younger generations that are coming about, there's so many more creative ideas. Each generation has, its own unique thing and challenge to solve. And if that time goes past, we miss that opportunity to engage specifically in those particular challenges. So I think it's really important to not just, validate youth in general, but it's also like a time sensitive thing as well, because if you miss this generation of youth, they won't come back again. It's not something that we can go back in time and revisit.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to look at youth engagement and conceptualize it that isn't thought about too often. So thanks so much for adding that in. Yeah, not sure if anyone else has any other points. If not, I think we can kind of wrap it up here by looking at some general summaries of what was presented and talked about. Obviously, there's so much more that we talked about in this really fruitful and really interesting discussion here, but from the presentation and some of the insights that we gathered, I think something that we can take from this to summarize that presentation is that governments definitely need to take a lot more action on climate action, and that's something that youth are looking for, and investing in that climate action. But the need for urgent climate finance for pipeline development of young people's innovation and solutions is really important. the fact that young people globally want their governments to set decarbonization targets based on these youth priorities and perspectives to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2030, I found super striking. And I think that's important to note as well, is that young people want this action to happen quite quickly and to happen now. And a big challenge is that incrementalization aspect, and how are we going to actually implement these goals now that we've set them. And then another thing is that for the call to action is to develop those meaningful opportunities for young people that we mentioned to engage in city level and regional climate actions, and not in a way that tokenizes young people and their perspectives, but that actually understands the value of youth perspectives and uses them in a way that's effective for that climate action. And then finally, developing solutions and policies based on those region-specific data points that we mentioned for local contexts. So it's really great to have these overarching global perspectives, but also equally as important to have these regional differences highlighted as well, to show how one solution might not necessarily be the best fit. It might not be a universal solution that fits all regions, and that's why having that local and regional context is important as well. So just in terms of next steps that happen here, I think we've outlined a lot of next steps that governments and institutions and energy actors can take in our conversation. But I think generally discussing and developing a plan for how organizations will consult youth and include their perspectives in these planning processes is really important. Developing that strategy to make sure that these opportunities are meaningful and accessible, like what we mentioned, to make sure that it includes as many youth as possible. And then finally, incorporating the Youth Policy Innovations Team's insights and recommendations into these action plans. And be sure to look out for that when that final report comes out later this year. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning into our session. And these are some of the websites that I've put here for people to keep in touch with Student Energy's work and look out for that report that's coming out. And then also to be in touch with what the Global Covenant of Mayors is doing and the Center, Melbourne Center for Cities. Thank you so much.
Awesome. The last thing to mention is that Kathy mentioned here there's a North American Mayor's reception in the mayor space that you said to jump onto. So
two things, if I can do two housekeeping, yes, absolutely. Jump on to see the North American Caribbean mayoral reception, while not maybe in the youth category, certainly in a youth supporter category. There's an excellent welcome from Al Gore. It's really fabulous, but also the Knowledge Center on the website has a lot of discussion boards and a lot of the threads and ideas and real priorities that have been raised in this session. Please head into the Knowledge Center and make sure that these ideas and the reports that have been mentioned and the links, the data that you've presented is featured. But I know that our rapporteurs are also capturing the information to make sure that these insights feed into the conference report as well. But thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much, everybody. Take care, everybody. Bye.